All right. Hey, Honey Wash Day, which means good morning in Lakota. Hope everybody's having a good morning, and I'm ready to start. This is the first time I've ever used this system. I'm used to being in a classroom full of very active 15-year-olds. How many of you I wonder how many of you have actually experienced that wonderful event, but the axial age is something that's fascinating me for a long time. And when I was teaching those 15-year-olds, this was Western civilization, which is the old Egypt, Mesopotamia, through Greece, Rome, Middle Ages, and on up into Napoleon Bonaparte and so on. And I discovered a critical thinking process, which I introduced into that class. And beginning with Egypt, we would start talking about issues in Egypt, and we'd begin a process of developing hypotheses, and that type of thing. And then eventually, when we moved into Greece, I had them work to test hypotheses. And I would pose a question. Most good questions were contradictions. They'd be something like one I used to use is if Athens was a democracy, why was Socrates brought to trial and then sentenced to death for expressing his ideas? And so then they'd have to develop hypotheses to try to see, get some answers to the contradiction and so on. And then when we moved into Rome, they would be concluding about their issue, but I'd add another very important step. And that step was to create generalizations, which tells you about human nature and the nature of human societies. And that kind of evolved into, well, not all human societies go this direction, but one type of society does. And that is when humans begin to create a state, or what people often call civilizations. Once you develop a state, then things start to become predictable. And so every place we went, through the Middle Ages, into the High Middle Ages, the Renaissance, then into European nationalism and expansion, these same generalizations kept popping up. Didn't matter if you were in Egypt or in Napoleon Bonaparte's time and that kind of thing. And every time a generalization would be created, we would reword it from such and such may tend to, and then when we see it coming up again, it becomes, we drop the may off of it. So then we say may does tend to do this. And then eventually we get to where we're looking at a high percentage of accuracy to a generalization, which now becomes kind of a law of human nature. And some years ago, I stumbled into a process that was doing the same thing, called the Axial Age. And the Axial Age was developed by a group of German historians because they began to identify the same thing. And it didn't matter whether you were talking about Chinese history or German history or whatever. Once a state is formed, which is boundaries are created, there's strong tendencies that humans go in certain directions. And that's what motivated the coming of the Axial Age. So this course is developed along those lines. First of all, what is the Axial Age? And we'll kind of examine that first section. We'll be trying to identify what that is. And then the real important aspect of the course is the qualities of the Axial Age. And here's where we get into the strong tendencies of repeating. But to see that, you have to be, if you can picture a forested area, to see that those tendencies repeating, you have to be kind of flying over the canopy of the forest. You see the overview of the forest. And then eventually, when you're flying over the canopy, sometimes you want to go down and look at the trees, and you get into more specificity, and then back up into the canopy again, the canopy again. So by kind of working those two areas, you begin to form these tendencies. And what's great about that, you begin to see predictability. You begin to see things, it becomes predictable. And this is true of state forms of socio-political systems, which we call civilizations. So we'll deal with that, and then we'll get into my area of passion. We're beginning to move a little bit into that, maybe about the fourth week, into colonialism and how the Axial Age continued into that period. That'll be a global colonialism. Then we'll move into American, and then we'll talk more about institutionalization of America and the two worlds in America. So to start, that's just kind of a very brief overview. And I chose this picture because the reason I wanted to show this picture is because I can't stop looking at it. There's something about this picture I think is really beautiful. So to start with, this is kind of a chart, and we don't need to look at it in specificity. If you just kind of look at the general flow of it. And the different colors on here, on the left-hand side represents the Aegean state or civilization, the Egyptian state, ancient Hittites. Then the green is Amorites, the blue Iranians, India is the pink color, Huns, and then finally the Chinese. And the overview of what you see once a state is formed is an ebb and flow. And this picture is covering 1,500 year time period. So as you see over that 1,500 year time period, that these cultures, once the state is formed into what we call civilizations, they don't stay up there. They ebb, they flow, then they ebb, and so on. And so scholars tend to view historic events and eras as separate. Now I've listed three kind of diverse examples there, Rome and China and so on. But then the question we pose for the Axial Age is, but are they? Are they really separate? Dr. Carl Jaspers proposed all are part of an unbroken stream that flows into the present. In other words, what happened 2,000 years ago is affecting us as you woke up this morning. It's still going on, and it's still a continuation and a continual flow. It's not broken into different parts and that kind of thing. That's the basic principle of the Axial Age. Now, that group of German historians and philosophers, out of that group, Carl Jaspers, he's pictured over there on the left, is the one that coined the term. To put a title on what the German intellectual movement was discovering and trying to pull together. And the concept of the Axial Age actually began in the latter part of the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, and into the first half of the 20th century. And is still a concept that's oftentimes thought of before or today, mainly because it gives order to something that's really confusing. When you see the rise and fall of all these cultures, it appears to be separate and confusing. What the Axial Age does is give a consistent order to begin to look at these cultures, whether it's the rise of the state of China or the state of Brazil or Great Britain. Once a state is formed, they tend to go through these same patterns of movements. So I'll just briefly, I think Lori sent you a copy of this page. And what's interesting is that the German historians saw the Axial Age beginning in India and Iran. Now, and they identified a 400-year time period for the axle itself, just the axle part. But the axle spins, the metaphor, the axle spins, and of course, out of that comes the energy, which continues way beyond the location of the axle itself. You know, there's a metaphorical concept there. What's also interesting about this concept is that other state level of civilizations formed earlier than this. But it's this one that added consistency that puts us into the present moment here in the 21st century. Egypt, Mesopotamia, all started earlier than this period, but they became tributaries into the Axial Age River. Does that concept make sense? Pretty much, okay. So these earlier civilizations, you had the Indus River Valley, and today what we call Pakistan and India as one of the early ones, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and a recent discovery in Peru is Norte Chico, which actually the cities in Norte Chico in Peru date as far back as the early Egyptian developments. So we have the cradle of civilizations now also forming in the American hemisphere. So concomitant with that development, once borders are formed into a state level, and you get a kind of a hierarchy of power structure that automatically begins to form when that happens, there's a disconnect that begins to happen with the natural world. And there's a shift that begins to happen. And that this one down here, moral compass shifted from relationship with nature to religious dogma, religious belief system. Zoroaster becomes a pretty important element in that shift. The Greeks called it Zoroaster. That might be more familiar to you, but Zoroaster, no one knows if this was a human being or simply the name of a movement. Ancient people oftentimes named whole movements like that. So the key shift in Zoroaster is that salvation of the human soul becomes a significant thing. And along with that, the samsaric cycle, which is the Hindu-Buddhist cycle of many lifetimes to get into nirvana. So in other words, you begin to develop a sense of abstract ideologies that begin to play a very important part once there's this breakaway from the natural world. What's also fascinating about this development, which happens all around the globe when this happens, is you begin to get a masculine side domination. The feminine side of who we are begins to lose position at that point. I have quite a bit to say about that, because when we talk about masculine, feminine, it goes beyond gender. It's more of a form of a way of being, a way of approaching life, a way of a kind of energy. For example, myself, my gender is male. I also have a feminine side. And so the purposes of looking at this particular class is to see that I may be grounded in my masculine side, but I can also pull on my feminine side, which is a relational type of the side, more relationship oriented than the masculine side. And women do the same. You're grounded in the feminine side, but can also pull on the masculine side. Whoops, moved a little too fast there. I'm not a technological genius. Imagine most of you are really astute in technology, but this is like a whole new learning process for me. So
Gil,
I might mess up.
Lori. Gil, this is Lori. You're doing outstanding. Just keep it up.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yes. So an important thing about once borders are drawn and a state is formed, and you get a political hierarchy kind of structure, a lot of things start happening to us, our attitudes and our psyche and things like that. But there's an environmental discount, and the rise of masculine domination automatically leads to more aggressive societies. And I think that's pretty understandable. It's the masculine side of who we are, our humanity is. If we're relying on that, the societies are going to become more aggressive. Because the feminine side of who we are is the self-restraint side. It's the part that uses good judgment. So then we move on down to this next area, the masculine linear process side. And we begin to think in terms of what is progress. And we begin to see progress as material. The more material we have, we're progressing. And that's the very masculine side. And so we begin to see time as progress. The question is it really progress? So, for example, you've probably heard this statement before. The statement like, I cannot believe this is happening in the 21st century. And my mind goes to, why not? Well, we have cell phones. Cell phones, does that make us more relationship-oriented people or less? You know, things like that. So the distinction then begins to evolve in our mental attitudes. We begin to develop attitudes of one type of society is superior over another type because I have a screwdriver and they don't. You know, I'm just using a ridiculous example because actually it is kind of ridiculous. So. But the environmental, the more we rely on tool use, the greater environmental disconnect we experience. And so down on this, towards the end of the this paradigm, we move into trying to make clear the earlier civilizations started earlier than this. Cultures with borders and hierarchical power structure all started earlier, but it's the Indo-Aryan epicenter that would bring into synchronicity religious socio-political systems. And then all of this becomes global with the development of European colonialism. As the French go into Indochina and the British go into the Americas and Spain into South America Central. This all begins to expand out, and the impact of the Axial Age becomes literally global. This is the 18th dynasty of Egypt. So throughout the history of nation states, patterns of ebb and flow. Over 2,068 years, ancient Egypt rose and fell 3 times with no successful external invasion. I think that screams information to us, that Egypt actually fell without an invasion. And we always think, well, maybe there's an opposing force or something like that. I think there's something that tells us that there's an evolutionary cycle that happens whenever a state forms. And that evolutionary cycle is predictable because she experienced no real outside threats. First of all, on two sides, she's surrounded by the world's largest desert, and populations out there are relatively small. The north, she's got the Mediterranean, and to the east, the Red Sea, with only a real narrow land bridge that would connect her to these other cultures. And yet she fell anyway. That's why you have the Old Kingdom, then the first intermediary period, then you get the Middle Kingdom, then the second intermediary period, where she fell again and rebuilt into the Empire Age. This mask is 18th dynasty. You may recognize it as King Tut's. So like the flow of a river starts as a trickle, events thousands of years ago flow into the present. I think that's really a critical message for us today. Today, I woke up today and the world seems confusing. And I think our things we're facing with today is like the COVID-19. And we have a good response this morning to COVID-19 as we're sitting here in a sheltered in place so that we can avoid the virus. And we're doing a very positive response to that. And we're on Zoom, and I'm sitting here doing something I've never done before in my life. I'm looking at a computer screen, and I see kind of you guys over to the side, and I've never done this before in my life. And I'm going on 82 years old, for God's sakes. A change is never in, right? Yeah, it's just one of those things. But we are responding to something out there that's confusing. But we're doing the right thing by coming in and using now what we have, tools available to protect ourselves. So I put Carl Jasper's this list over here, shortened it to use a metaphor and to show this connection. And the metaphor being a spear. I put COVID-19 down here at the very tip of the spear. So as we woke up this morning and with our consciousness, every time and every minute we're at the tip of that spear. But we can move backwards across the shaft all the way back to the beginning of the Axial Age, 2,800 years. BP stands for before present. And I put the BC in there because most people are more familiar with using that category, but it's the same difference. We're looking at 2,800 years. We could go back further than that, but you got to start somewhere. So that's a good place to start with India and Iran and what was developing there. So the labels that you see, and if you've received a copy of this, this is great already. But what I did was just shorten up this page here in order to put it on the metaphor of the spear. So, and it's hard to know where to place these because it's not in a cause and effect order. A lot of these overlap. A lot of them are happening at the same time. So it's difficult to kind of see these as a list of cause and effect. So kind of if you can see it more as a body of characteristics that are a result of forming borders and creating a state form of socio-political system. These are all the results of doing that. And I'll just kind of review it real quick. Creation of borders, national states, there's a disconnect from nature and an anthropocentric mindset. That means we become human-centered. So the world becomes all about us, so to speak. Because we disconnect from nature, that leaves a void. And that void gets filled in kind of with abstract ideologies. One good example that we're dealing with today in the United States, abstract ideologies, is our political parties. And you see how there's such a divide here between the political parties. And yet, in the world of physics, there's only one truth, not a bunch of truths. Well, I take that back. You study quantum physics, that gets a little confusing. That begins to counter that idea. But the world of physics that we work with, there's only basically one truth. Also, what happens, objectification. Things become objectified when that happens. And we have a rise of masculine domination, and we're going to define institutionalization in more detail later. So let me kind of pause here just for a minute and see if there are any questions thus far. And can we kind of open it up for a moment to questions? And
Yes, you can now unmute yourself. If you take your mouse and scroll over the picture down in the bottom left-hand corner, if you're on a PC or a laptop, you'll see the mute button or the unmute button. And if you click it so the red line goes away, you are unmuted and you can ask your question.
Okay, it's Judy. Hi, Gil. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Judy.
Here I am. I'm still kind of confused. Was it inevitable that we moved into masculine domination, away from this kind of either balance or maybe feminine? And I kind of understand in early ages there was this nature worship, and of course that's still going on in some religions and societies. But was it inevitable that we get into masculine domination? And is this something that we just give into, or that we try to, I think I try to find balance in my life between the two. But that's, just disturbing to me that did it have to happen?
yeah, it's a great question. And that does pose something to look at very seriously. All the previous societies that moved into this socio-political type of organization did do this. Over the last 5,000 years, you get this masculine side. And you may get gender-wise, a woman rises to power, but if you think about Margaret Thatcher, for example,
Yeah, I know.
In her position, she pulled completely on her masculine side of who she is. The question now becomes, could she have risen to that position if she remained in her basic feminine side? And masculine may have been her base, I don't know. But that would have been unusual if it actually worked. That poses a question, a very serious question. And the question which we experience in the world today is, and what the feminine side of who we are offers to us is so valuable, which is relationship orientation and proper restraint. Proper restraint. And this is something we have to look at very seriously. It's not all about power grabbing and aggression and all that kind of thing. And the feminine side offers a more balanced way. So your question is so very valuable. And I think we live in a society where we still have to deal, in spite of the fact that the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, which gave women, for the first time after, what's that, 150 some years, women for the first time the right to vote and hold office in the United States. I think we have to look at ourselves and assess, where are we today? Wednesday, May the 20th, 2020. Have we progressed since 1920? How far have we come? I think it's a very serious thing to really look at. The tendency of these states to move in this direction is something to, and is there a correction? Is there a way to correct that? We'll try to look for that through the next 5 weeks after this.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, if I could toss in something here, sort of a follow-up to Judy's question. You mentioned both in what you said and on the handout, the cyclical ramifications of the goddess complex. And could you elaborate a bit on that? What and where was the goddess complex?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I think I recognize Alan's voice. I don't have your picture.
You do.
It's good to have you here. It's interesting to look at Greek history in dealing with that. When you have the Cycladic gods, I may be mispronouncing that, in the Aegean Islands, before Greece was strongly formed into a state level. And that represented the feminine side of the universe, of the energy in the universe. But then as the city-states become more formalized, this really shifts in a very drastic way. And you have, like, the goddess Athena becomes a warrior goddess with armor and things like that. So you have some shifts that are going on there. You still have Aphrodite, who's very feminine, but you begin to have some shifts there. When you get back into before the state is formed, the studies I've come, and I have to just talk about North America because there's too much. I can't, I don't know about people's a lot other than North American, but you have a masculine feminine balance, and that became very important in their socio-political systems before you get the colonial period developing and a lot of changes start taking place at that point. But does that kind of answer your question? We also have some slides further down that'll begin to address some of that as well.
Okay, so primarily it was Greek and Near East then?
Where you have this very strong masculine in their spirituality, and the goddess part begins to lose position. In Mesopotamia, you have, I got to try to overcome my senior moments here. Ishtar, I believe, was the goddess in the early Sumerian, Babylonian, but she begins to also lose position.
Okay.
I think we see that pattern developing. Okay. Anything else? Or Ellen, did you have more of a comment?
Gil, I was just going to mention real quickly, I don't know if you're going to talk about individual people here, personalities, but I've always thought that the Buddha, coming along 6 centuries before Jesus of Nazareth, was certainly a very seminal figure in terms of the rise of abstract ideologies and getting away from the world and getting into the world of the mind and communing with nature and freeing oneself from the samsara cycle as he viewed it and that sort of thing. I mean,
Right.
he was certainly a pivotal figure, I would think.
Right, exactly. And I think, and it's interesting, I think there's another slide, I get into that a little bit past this one. So what you have are, when you start talking about tendencies, you see a feminine side to also to some of the Buddhists. And I'm thinking about when Buddhism moved into China, and you get the
Bodhisattva.
yeah,
Bodhisattva?
yeah, Bodhisattva. Thank you. Where the Bodhisattva lives many lifetimes and then got up into the gateway to Nirvana, and then says, "Wait a minute, I'm going to turn around and I'll come back when everybody else, and I can bring everybody else with us," which, you know, to me is a very powerful concept, and it is feminine. To me, that's a very feminine side that you see happening. So what we see is a sense of relativity, where you begin to see cultures moving more and more towards the masculine side. You also see the feminine side sometimes becoming lesser. It's all relative, you know, it's not like an either or, suddenly they jumped over 1,000-year time period of evolutionary process. So I think you can still find elements of the feminine side in some cultures. But I think also when you look at China and you look at the socio-political systems of Southeast Asia and so on, you also begin to see a loss of influence of that side. Pardon me?
I think somebody's got some background noise going on.
Oh, okay, okay. I hope that kind of begins to answer the question. I think it's one thing that's important is that everything is relative and it's always a matter of degree. So the question always becomes, how far over did it go? How far did it go to eliminate the masculine or feminine side of who we are? But when you factor in the state, for example, of China, where the concept of the bodhisattva, you know, kind of emerged in China, but you also have the loss of the Tao. Eventually, you get the loss of Confucianism, and as a matter of fact, in many cases, it became illegal, depending on what time period you're looking at in these cultures during Mao Zedong and so on. Some of these actually became illegal. So when you look at that, what happens to that side of who we are, you also factor in kind of the socio-political system of the time. I hope that kind of answers that question.
Wow.
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Okay, I think we're ready to move on then if there are no more.
Okay, hang on
As
just a
long as,
second.
I hope that's clear of how this axial age looks.
Right.
Absolutely. I am going to mute everyone again. So Gil, hang on with me for just a second while I do that.
Okay.
Hang on. You are unmuted, Gil. Take it away.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, so just bring in the visual on a map of the beginning of the axial age. And the formation of the Euro-American mindset is where we're going with this. Keep in mind the axial age was only a 400-year period, but it's called axial. Carl Jaspers coined that term for it because it represents the axle of spinning where the energy flows out into all directions and affects us even today in the 21st century. The other point I want to make sure that this is only the tipping point that started a continuation. There are other civilizations that started before this time, but became kind of like tributaries into the mainstream. So just to reinforce the metaphor, every moment of today is at the tip of that spear, which dates all the way back to India and Iran. So I want to kind of introduce Carol Quigley. When we talk about what is civilization, Carol Quigley got his bachelor's, master's, and PhD from Harvard in history. He became a professor at Harvard, Yale, and finally Georgetown University. And I believe he taught at Georgetown for about 25 years. And the book, one of his books that I read decades ago, and another day I was looking for it in my library and couldn't find it. I don't know what happened to it, but The Evolution of Civilization. And to me, it was an incredible work, well-researched and very well done. And that was published in 1961. And he used that as one of his textbooks in his history classes at Georgetown. Another one that he used, a very powerful book, if I can get over another senior moment here. Gosh. Sometimes it crawls into my frontal lobe. But anyway, he published that one in 1961. And the other one in 1964. I'm trying to think of the name of it. But one of the things that comes out of that book is a quote I put up here: a producing society with an instrument of expansion. A civilization's decline occurs when its instrument of expansion is transformed into an institution. That is, when social arrangements that meet real social needs are transformed into social institutions serving their own purposes regardless of real social needs. And that gets coined, the term for that happening is, the term coins that as institutionalization. So he becomes quite an influential figure as far as influencing some heads of state and who have actually taken his class. People in the have risen pretty high in our own political system. Were in some of his classes. So let's jump back historically. What we're interested in here is following a conceptual timeline using the canopy of the forest to kind of guide us through. This is not really a sequential. We're going to focus on the conceptual aspects of the axial age. So this particular section will deal with the historic present, and we'll jump to present examples, and we'll also use historic examples through this. So we're not going to be following a timeline sequentially. We're going to be more focused on the conceptual aspect. Yeah, the main thing we want to look at is patterns and the qualities within those patterns of development. So another metaphor to introduce here is the tapestry of patterns. So all these things that we talked about in the axial age that identifies the axial age, those qualities, are like threads that we're weaving together, creating a whole tapestry, so that you see a one whole concept of what happens around the world to these state forms of organization. So this comes back to kind of what I believe Alan was mentioning a while ago. We have 4 pictures here. The one on the left identifies tribal form of socio-political organizations. And there are no images formed here other than the physical world. And the cultures I'm familiar with north of the Rio Grande into Canada. And I can say I'm barely familiar. I mean, there's so much information and understanding. And throughout our history, there have been so many changes in native peoples. What I've tried to do in my studies of North America is go back to pre-1492. And that's taken me almost 40 years to peel all those layers back, because there have been so many changes since the arrival of Columbus in native cultures. But what I wanted to do is find out what was here for the past 15,000 years before the Europeans arrived, and what system did they have, and how did that work? How was that functioning? And did it serve the population well, or is the state level going to serve us well? You know, these kind of questions that come to mind here. So, so on the left, you see a woman to represent the feminine side, because in these cultures, there was a strong tendency towards masculine feminine balance in their socio-political systems. The feminine side had a strong equal influence as the masculine side. That's pre-1492. So then we move to Egypt, and we're looking on that axial line shaft of the spear. We're looking at disconnect from nature, anthropocentric mindset, development of a human-centered mindset, and a control. Societies which begin to think in terms of controlling. And so the first image we have is, I put Anubis in here just as an example. And the Egyptian Anubis, ancient Egyptian, now you have a human body, you have an image. Instead of the trees, you now have an image of a human body, which is separating kind of from the trees, but you have the head of a jackal. And Anubis had to do with whether you entered into the afterlife or not. Then we move on over to the Hindu Ganesh. Ganesh is the son of Shiva. And as a child, Ganesh lost his head. His head was chopped off. And Ganesh replaced the head, or I'm sorry, Shiva replaced the head with an elephant's head. There's a metaphor. Of course, all these are metaphors. The metaphor here is that in life, we all face difficulties. And sometimes those difficulties are such that we don't see how we can possibly get through it. Ganesh is the one who helps us clear the path of our life's journey. So Ganesh is about our journey in life, basically. And when I spent 2 weeks in India in an ashram, 1 week in an ashram in Rishikesh, India, what I found in Rishikesh was that Shiva was not just a corpse or the god of the end of life or anything. Shiva was really talking about, in order to grow, you have to shed certain parts of who you are, or else you'll get blocked. And his son, Ganesh, is part of that shedding, part of that clearing the way. So it's a very powerful image and a very meaningful image personally for our lives. So then we get over to the Greeks, and we have a complete anthropomorphism that's emerged here in the form of Hercules, which is also Roman, originated with the Greeks. Hercules and Zeus both live on the island of Crete. And that's true for the Greeks, who still honor, revere these metaphors, these very powerful mythological images. That's still true today. They still live on the island of Crete. But one thing you notice here is that the body of Hercules the perfection level of that body is beyond human capability. Hercules is a god. So what you see is this anthropomorphic movement that you find that once we begin to disconnect with nature, which begins to happen once we begin to form boundaries and borders and form this hierarchical state form of socio-political system. One thing to note also here, like my schooling taught me to think about linear progression, the time equals progress. But looking at these images from left to right, from the trees and the feminine side to the separation and the different images, more humanistic looking, there is no ranking here. My brain wants to go immediately to say Hercules is a higher development, but I have to correct that because that's not true. All of these are real strong, powerful metaphors, and there is no ranking of one superior over the other. And that was something I have to overcome because I was conditioned to think another direction. But Anubis is not inferior to Hercules in a thought process, in other words. They're all pretty even, and also the tribal form also is a very powerful relationship in their type of spirituality. So I just kind of wanted to make note of that. So now we're going to hop immediately into the present from there. And this is a downtown central business district area of a major city in the country. I'm wondering how many of you actually been there? How many of you know where that is? Yeah, if you know, I only have 4 images here, but if you know, raise your hand. Or I'm just kind of, I think this is kind of fun. This is my hometown. I was born and raised. I was born about 2 miles from this picture and lived almost all my life, except for the years I was in college. And 1 year I taught in Racine, Wisconsin. So 6 years, I did not live in this metropolitan area, but I was born about 2 miles from here, which means I lived in this area for 75 years. And that is downtown Kansas City. Power and Light, or I'm sorry, this building, the big building right there over to the left is what's the name? Yeah, Kansas City Place. Some of you may recognize that. So down here, abstract ideologies disconnect us from the natural world. I don't see nature here really, unless you go down to the middle of the screen, down at the very bottom on top of it. I imagine most of you have been up and down Main Street, and right across from Kansas City Place, that tallest building, and that is the tallest building in the state of Missouri, by the way. The building right across from it actually has a place on the rooftop with vegetation actually growing up there. It's almost kind of park-like. But the main point here is there's this disconnect from the natural world. And if you've ever been out on our freeways during rush hour, you know about rising stress levels, probably. But now we're going to jump over to, this is the Great Wall of China. It's incredible. It took centuries to actually complete the wall. But the problem is Genghis Khan breached that wall several times in the 13th century with the Mongol invasion out of the north. So the wall didn't really hold them out. But the importance of this wall is that it's a very clear vision or view of a border, the border of China, as they tried to create a border and hold other people out. Well, what does that do to us psychologically? It creates a sense of them and us. I think there's all communities that have a sense of them and us. But this is kind of where relativity fits in. The border begins to intensify that natural tendency to view your community as us and the other people kind of as another community. But borders begin to intensify that notion. So borders, political parties, organized religions, economic theories, all abstract ideologies that go along with the rise of the state. They're just companions together. It just seems to always happen that way. Egalitarianism ebbs as states rise. And what I mean, I had two definitions of egalitarianism. One is tribal, and the other is a state type of definition. The tribal definition is that all life in the universe is equal. A tree outside has a right to a life as well. And it has a spiritual force that accompanies that tree. My life also has that spiritual force. And in the north of the border tribal cultures, we're really all one because we came from the same creation 13 to 14 billion years ago when the universe was created. We all came out of that same place. And the Lakotas call that Wakan. The Jesuits translated that into sacred, but in Lakota it doesn't mean sacred. It means our relationship to each other, which started from the very beginning. Once the borders are formed, like this example of the Great Wall of China, you've created a state. You've created what we usually refer to as a civilization. You're no longer tribal. And the definition of egalitarian shifts, it changes. And it becomes gender oriented or masculine feminine oriented. So once these borders are formed, the feminine side has a tendency to lose its position. And the masculine side begins to dominate. Why is that? Part of it is the intensification of them and us. So if you think about the masculine side, is the defending side. It's the side that defends against an outside force. So that side, so our psyche begins to shift our thought process to our border walls on our Mexican border, for example. Or if you want to go to Canada, you have to have a passport now. You know, for years I went to Canada, I didn't need a passport. Now I do. So we begin to get the shift of happening that begins to happen. And that takes us over kind of to the masculine side. Also with that, the fibers of community fray as borders define who we are. Who am I? Well, people would say, you're an American. If I'm talking to somebody from Germany, I'm German. That becomes the dominating force. When I go to a football game out at Arrowhead or the Royal Stadium and they do the Star Spangled Banner, that's not about Kansas City or my community in Clay County. It's about our national borders and that kind of thing. So we begin to get an intensification of them and us. So more about borders, the Berlin Wall. To skip back into Sparta, our shield wall is our border. And we have the California-Mexico wall. All of these are signs of a state form of socio-political system. So to follow the axial age further, separation from nature and the laws of physics coincide with the emergence of opposing ideologies. And the opposition can become evil, or there's so much divisiveness that just kind of begins to happen at that point. Yeah, name calling and that kind of thing. I could pause here if there are any questions. I'd like to kind of stop and see if there's kind of interaction that we may have at this point.
You can unmute yourself again by accessing that toolbar, by running your mouse over the slide and finding your mute button on a PC or laptop down there in your left-hand corner. Just click it to make the red line go away.
Without being in physical contact with them, and that's been
I heard somebody, but I didn't quite hear a question.
I think that was some background sound.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I think there are a lot of layers to this and so on. So that's why I like to kind of pause every once in a while and see if there are any thoughts or questions that you may have that we could discuss or anything like that. So so I realize it's a fairly complex, layered subject that we're dealing with a lot of characteristics that are involved here.
Well, Gil, this is Lori. I know that I'm your wingman and not a participant, but I have to say this is all extremely fascinating to think about civilization and its arc almost as a living organism that has stages of development.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I like the way that I like that living organism because I think that's it. Really, I really like your comment because it points out something about our humanity. And the state challenges us, I think, to maintain our humanity within a structured type of a system with the chain of command kind of organization and things like that. I know when I taught, every place I went, there was a chain of command. I had a boss that I better do what that boss says. And luckily, I was in high school education and I taught college for 14 years after I retired from high school. And as an educator, you don't have somebody, working right with you constantly. You have a lot more control than say you do in a corporate kind of structure. So I was kind of fortunate in that regard. I had more of a free access. And partly what I'm covering here, part of what I'm covering is what I learned from my sophomores. I learned I bet more from them than I taught them. And once I opened it up to this critical thinking process, and then I stumbled onto the Axial Age several years ago, and found out there was an actual body already developed that analyzed and put this into a structure, this paradigm, to really look at these civilizations globally. And that was just like, oh, wow. So I'd say my sophomores and my experience in teaching critical thinking and then coming across the Axial Age was a really self-growth process. And I have to can't say too much for 15-year-olds. And sometimes they're a little hard to control, but once they got really focused and things like that, it was an amazing experience. And I'm really grateful for that, having that job. Anyway, any other questions or comments so far? Okay. Okay, I think we can go on then. And what I'd like to stop the last 10 minutes maybe and have kind of discussion, if that's possible, somewhere in there okay.
That sounds great, Gil. Go ahead.
Okay. So let's go to Attica. Attica is the city-state of which Athens was the city. Most people usually just say Athens, but Attica. So I pose a question here. Was Attica the first great democracy? And so we look at Attica at the time of Socrates. When I flew into Athens, and I got a taxi cab from the airport into where my hotel was. And I joined a group of people once I got there. The cab driver, we're driving along, the cab driver, I'm talking about so great to be here, and I've always wanted to come to Athens, and I've studied, I'm a history, somebody who was a student of history and so on. And I mentioned the word Socrates, and he corrected me immediately. Said, "Oh no, it's not Socrates, it's Socrates." And I thought, oops, every professor I had pronounced it Socrates. And I'm thinking, all right, well, maybe I should start pronouncing Socrates. And I wonder how many other Greek names I'm mispronouncing. So I thought that was kind of fascinating. But the total estimated population at the time of Socrates, or Socrates, was of Attica, that's beyond Athens, but the whole city-state, was between 250 to 300,000 people. The vote was restricted to Athenians who could prove 5 generations of pure Athenian blood back. That took out and eliminated all those others except 100,000 people. Now, these are all approximations, of course, because no one knows exactly the populations. A number of citizens or non-citizens in Attica, slaves and metics made up 150 to 200,000 people. Slaves, you had a lot of slave labor. The metics were foreigners who moved to Athens for economic activity. And because Athens was a very prosperous city-state during this time period. And so it drew a lot of foreigners into Athens, but they didn't meet the criteria of being a pure Athenian blood, therefore could not participate in the democracy. So also another problem arises here is that women had no power in Athens. So they couldn't attend the meetings, they couldn't vote, couldn't hold office. So you take, even if you could prove your citizenship, that you're pure Athenian, the fact you were a woman left you out. So that leaves us now down to the participation out of 250 to 300,000 people. Only about 30,000 ever participated in the Athenian democracy. So that kind of poses the question, can we really call that the first great democracy? When I was in Greece, the person that was leading our tour for the 3 weeks I was there was saying, well, Greece is the world's first great democracy. But then I went to India, and I heard in India that India was the world's first democracy. And then I come back to the United States and I hear the United States is the world's first great democracy. So we have a lot of people claiming to be the first world's democracy. I want to come back to Carroll Quigley again in the quote below. And this is a very interesting comment that he made. And when I read the comment, I was reviewing Quigley again for this class. And I read the comment and it really struck me because kind of what we're going through today. It says absolute democracy does not really exist at the nation state level. I thought, yeah, let me think about that a little bit further. And he does go on to explain that quite a bit further about our electoral system. An interesting comment he makes about that is that on the average, for a general presidential election in the United States, there's only about a 50% turnout to vote. And he makes a comment that if only 2% more vote, it could very easily completely change the election into a whole nother party, a whole nother, you know. And so I thought that was an interesting comment that he made there. It also goes into the structure of how the system operates, which supports the statement that does not really exist at the nation state level. This has to do with abstract ideologies. And one of the outdoor theaters, this is on the Peloponnesus, Epidaurus. This is an amazing place. And when I was on that tour in Greece, we visited this theater. And if you can see the lower levels, that whole lower section was built by the Greeks. The upper section, a narrower section up above that, there's a walkway in there, was built by the Romans when they came in and conquered that area. So they asked us to go up and sit up in the Roman section. And they stood down here where the plays would have been carried on. And they talked in a normal voice. And way up there, I could hear every word they said. And they said, the comment was, Epidaurus is one of the best acoustical outdoor theaters in the world. And it's amazing to think how long ago they built that. And the fact you could sit way up there and hear everything they were saying. But the Greek plays were about these abstract ideologies, you know, that happen, always seem to happen in these state level of organizations, socio-political. So the first one up here is Aristophanes. His dramas warned audiences to give due respect to the gods and their rituals in defiance of rising interest in science and political dichotomies. This is the time of Socrates or Socrates. And this is a time where you're getting all these people, Plato, Aristotle, and all these other people. And what they're talking about is challenging the old traditions and the old spiritual religious traditions of the Athenian pantheons and the Greek pantheons. So you have this challenge and this split that's happening here. And so your playwrights tend to be producing plays that are very traditional, that defend the old traditional ways of being. And so Aristophanes is one of them. Sophocles is fascinating, especially his plays on Oedipus. In the first play, Oedipus Rex. And what Sophocles was trying to say is the old traditional religions with the Greek gods is that your life was already predestined. There's nothing you could do to change it. That you didn't have an independent will at all, that the gods were in total control. And so Sophocles is trying to defend that in his play, Oedipus Rex. So Oedipus, as a young man, visits the Oracle of Delphi. He's told the shocking truth that he will kill his father and marry his mother, which he cannot prevent. And the play unfolds, and he meets his father out on a path as he's entering a new city-state. And they get in a fight and he kills him. He doesn't know that's his father. And he goes on into the city-state. It's a lengthy play, but just real quick, he falls in love with this woman, an older woman, and turns out to be his mother. So the prophecy of the oracle comes true. And the play is ending with him standing down in the middle of the circle there, the place at Epidaurus. And he's so agonized, he pokes his eyes out. And he's screaming his final speech to the audience up there. And Sophocles is trying to say, don't veer away from the old gods. Don't try to challenge that. Don't listen to Socrates and Plato and these people. They don't know what they're talking about, is basically. And so that's why I put Socrates down here. I no longer know how to pronounce his name, by the way, because I keep going back to Socrates, and so on. But so all this is just so fascinating to me to think about all these different ways of human responses and that. So you have a dividing line between the very conservative traditionalists in Athens during this time and the more progressive elements in Athens that's happening. The question comes about again, is this really a democracy? Is it the first great democracy? Or is it a movement towards democracy? There's a relativistic issue here that I think we're dealing with. So back up on the Axial Age concepts, borders at the top, abstract ideologies, and masculine domination. I think at this point, this is a very detailed, I'm going to be using 2 slides. We're going to talk about the trial of Socrates. We're going to talk something about how the structure of the Athenian the government evolved to the tyrants. And the tyrants is not the same definition in ancient Greece as we use today. That's a very important distinction. But Draco, Solon, and Clisthenes to be the three tyrants. All that tyrant means in ancient Greece is that they came to power outside the normal inheritance of power. That's all that means. Draco and Solon were both of aristocratic families, but were at a lower level of aristocracy that normally wouldn't have inherited the power. Clisthenes, his mother was of aristocracy, and his father was of common birth, but pure Athenian. So the tyrant only means that they're not following the normal chain of command, basically. And then we get into Pericles, in which Athens was at her very height at that time point, which eventually leads to the Peloponnesian War with Sparta and so on. And this all sets kind of the background for the trial of Socrates. So I think we could stop at this point, and if we could have maybe a time for questions. Always kind of been teaching, I've always used interaction in the classes, and any questions or comments or any discussion ideas you would like to bring up, that would be wonderful.
Just a
And that'll
reminder,
take us to the end of the class.
Just a reminder, you can unmute yourself by finding your mute icon and clicking on it so that the red line goes away. Everyone has the power to do that at this point. So if you have a question, please unmute yourself.
Okay, if there are any ideas you would like to add or statements or questions, or maybe a comment on how it's going, or is it fairly clear as to what the axial age is and how it's applied and so on? Because I realize it's a fairly complex topic.
I definitely wanted to get everything from.
Lori, I didn't quite hear.
I think that was some background noise.
Oh.
Everybody somebody has their hand raised. Wendy does.
Okay.
Wendy, I am.
Yes, I do have a question. Sorry, it kept saying that I couldn't unmute.
Gotcha.
Okay, so my question is on the tendencies. It seems to me that whistleblowers, even if they're coming from a man, is more the feminine side. And I'm just wondering what you think about that throughout history. And then like the masculine response is usually to persecute the whistleblower instead of fixing the problem.
Yeah, I think you're right on. And again, we when we talk about feminine and masculine, we don't want to just think about gender. There's our tendency, or my tendency, I should speak only for myself, to go to man woman, and this is much broader than that. And so whether it's a man or woman who's a whistleblower, it's somebody obviously who cares and has a sensitivity, and I think it's also somebody with a lot of courage. The feminine side of who we are tends to be a very courageous side, because the relationship, the connecting side of who we are has a deep sense of interpersonal relationship. And when they see something going wrong, or people getting hurt, or potentially, it takes a lot of courage to go against the power structure that we have in this country, or any state form of socio-political system, to step out and try to do the right thing. And I've been through my own situations where I felt a need to do the right thing, but I was afraid. I was afraid of what would happen, the consequences. And sometimes challenging that fear is part of what Ganesh back there in the Hindu thing was all about. Challenging the fear. Ganesh helps you kind of clear away that wreckage, that blockage in your way. That's what I like about that metaphor. And to be able to overcome that. And so I really appreciate that question too, because I believe you're right. You have a conflict, a clash here. When you have a whistleblower, a clash between the feminine side of who we are in our humanity and the masculine side of who we are in our humanity. So yeah, I think that's a very excellent point.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, I can.
Okay. Looking at the spear and the sort of progression or change that occurs in groups and civilizations, as a civilization declines and is replaced by another, by being conquered or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a fluid process that moves back and forth? I mean, depending upon where the succeeding group is sort of at in their developmental process?
Yes, I think that's a very good point. It is. It's like if you've ever been to the coast, to the ocean, and you see the waves coming in, pulling back and coming in again. That's kind of what we see here. Is an ebb and flow, but each successive event is more intense than the last one, because it's a gradual progression kind of thing. It's like you know, like in growth, you know, every time I grew, it was 2 steps forward and 1 back, and then 2 steps forward and 1 back. And the same thing happens when you see corruption or dangers occurring. The next time gets more serious than the last time was. And you can trace that in Rome. Rome history is really a good one to trace that one in. Especially when you're looking at the western half of the Roman Empire, which fell in 476 AD. The eastern half continued to stand. But it not only applies to our personal lives as an individual, but it seems to also apply to nation states. So if you get past one crisis, one of the key things, I think, is to look seriously at what happened and see if you can't correct it. Because if you don't do that, you can guarantee the next one will be worse. Any other questions? Or did I answer your question okay?
You did, yes.
Okay, great, great. I heard a beep or something.
Any other questions for Gil? All right, well, I'm going to assume that pause means no one else has a question. If you do have a question, you can unmute yourself, again, by finding that icon and making that red line go away. When we are done here today, I will be uploading the recording of today's class to our YouTube channel, and you will be getting an email from me with a link to that channel so that you can access it and see this recording and recording of all of our other classes on that YouTube channel. We do not intend to take those down at any point. We intend to leave them up for quite some time. So you have time to go back. It also means that if you are unable to make a class, you'll be able to see it later as a recording. So on that note, any final questions for Gil?
Yeah, I would like to thank everybody for coming and looking forward to next week. And I want to thank Lori for her excellent job of having this technology work for us. I think it's incredible because I'm totally confused.
You did a great job, Gil.
Well, thank you, and thanks to everybody for attending. I guess in our own what do we call it, shelter-in-place location. So, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Oh, wait. Judy Kirk has a question. Hang
Okay.
on, let me unmute her. Judy, can you unmute yourself? Oh, there you are.
I'm hearing somebody.
Now we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Oh. Huh. Well, it finally took the mute button off. Okay, only one quick easy question maybe, or comment. I'd love when I start seeing some dates, Gil, and I love it if you could kind of throw dates into your conversation. Because when you
Okay.
started talking about Socrates, this aging brain is racing back to when was that?
Yeah, 399 BC is when he took the poison to and died.
So that kind of puts me in place. I love it. So I saw it finally in the the printout, but I didn't hear it in your talk.
Okay.
Also, what would be the actual dates of the Axial Age?
So the Axial Age, what the German historians place as the axial itself would be 800 BC to 200 BC.
Okay. Huh.
So the spinning of the axle sent out this this whole process that continues on today.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, good.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Oh, good. Okay, who knows?
Okay, any other questions? All right, well, I look forward to next week.